So I just checked this morning, there's more than 10 million trait records on about 325 different kinds of traits from 1.2 million taxa. Now, not all of those taxa have 325 traits, as in fact most of them don't. But I published a paper on this a few years ago called Trait Bank Practical Semantics. So this is the background that I'm bringing into this work, and I thought for kicks I would just look up what we have for domestic cattle on Encyclopedia of Life, and I don't expect you to be able to read this, but along the left you'll see that there's traits for distribution, physical description, ecology. I've opened up the tab for life history and behavior traits. There's also evolution and physiology and conservation. So it's a wide range of kinds of information about organisms, and this is what we have. I think we have about 60-some traits for cattle. Now, of course, that's an aggregate across the entire species that has nothing specific to say about the different breeds that you all are working on. But you'll see there's a lot of interesting information, most of which has been drawn from particular databases that are already out there in public, and we've aggregated the information on Encyclopedia of Life. So the key to this is that information is out there in the public eye where it can be harvested for something like Trait Bank. And so that leads me to the project I'm going to talk about today, which is the Ag Data Commons, which is essentially a self-submission catalog of where agricultural data reside, and also an ecosystem of repositories. So we don't expect that all the data actually are in the Ag Data Commons itself, but the Ag Data Commons should know where the data are. So the vision is to gather all of that data and then transform it into knowledge so that people like farmers can translate knowledge into action. Now that's a very broad vision, very far-reaching vision. We're just getting started with this, and the first goal is to develop a one-stop shop, which I will talk about shortly. But eventually the idea is to establish a knowledge discovery environment and then use this to propel the digital agricultural revolution forward. And I think that our ability to do that will rest on researchers like you who are actually working out a lot of the specific techniques for how to do this and also generating a lot of the key data. So why are we building the Ag Data Commons? So you may recall that back in 2013, 2014, there were a few federal executive orders that had to do with making the results of publicly funded research available to the public, and also making sure that that information, whether it's data or scholarly publications, making sure that things are available in a machine-readable way. So that's one reason to do this. Another reason is just it's a good idea in order to do transparent science to make the data available so that people can check to make sure it truly supports the results that are coming out of the science. And not only the data, actually, it's really important to provide access to the models or the code that are used to analyze that data. This is actually the cover of a National Academy of Sciences report that came out back in April of this year that basically reviewed the status of this kind of effort to make research results as strong as possible and to avoid things like fraud. And it also emphasizes that the data should be made available with respect to disciplinary standards. So your community will need to come up with the standards that it will use to make data available, and also within the purview of the requirements from funders. All right, so here's another requirement, and this is from the scholarly journals. It turns out that if you do an analysis of the top journals where USDA researchers publish, in this case 2016, and you look at the top 50 journals and look at their data sharing policies, it turns out that in the blue on the right there, 22% of those journals are now requiring data to be made available upon publication, and 34% actually encourages. So that means over half of these top 50 publications have some sort of open data, if not requirement, then strong encouragement to make data available. And the problem comes here. If you take a look at all of the domain-specific repositories for data, most of them, the ones shown in red here, are not open for general submission. So unless you're already associated with some specific repository, you may not necessarily have a good place to park your data. And so this is part of the need that the Ag Data Commons is hoping to fill. All right, so this is a schematic of the concept, and as I mentioned earlier, it's a distributed ecosystem of repositories. So across the top in blue are a range of federal repositories, university repositories, industry repositories. Those may or may not already exist. We're not trying to duplicate those. The stuff that we're working on are the stuff in green in the middle there, which is basically a discovery interface or a catalog to all of those repository entries, tools such as application programming interfaces, down the line in the future, additional computational tools or analytic tools. And so data producers there on the left can submit their information to repositories, whether it's specifically to the Ag Data Commons or to one of these distributed repositories. They may be getting that data, by the way, from the kinds of sensors that you've already been talking about this morning. And then the data consumers on the right can use the Ag Data Commons to find what they need and do something interesting with it. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of specific things that might be familiar to you. So the Ag Data Commons imagines that it will be harvesting from the NCBI bioprojects, the I5K workspace, which is another NAL product here, and the Lifecycle Assessment Commons, which we also run here at the library. I heard this morning that there's a platform called Genomes to Fields. That would also be an example of a university repository that we would want to make sure to include in the catalog. Okay, so the platform that we're using, if you're interested, is called DCAN. It's actually built on the open source Drupal content management systems. It was originally designed for open government data, and so the different blocks here in this diagram are showing the added functionality that we've been working on to go on top of that. So there's the basic Drupal core of basically letting people register for accounts and give permissions and roles to those people. DCAN adds all of the core data repository and data cataloging functionality, but on the right is the stuff that has to do with research data. Because DCAN was originally designed for open government data, it doesn't necessarily have, or it did not necessarily have good support for things like citations to literature, author identifiers, citations, that sort of thing that we know the research community expects, and we also have added additional metadata that will make it possible to really reuse the data effectively. So we are working with Civic Actions, which is now the lead organization for this open source platform, and we're developing a research data distribution of DCAN so that not only the Ag Data Commons, but anybody else who needs a catalog or repository for research data will have bundled into it already the kind of features that are necessary. So our philosophy at the Ag Data Commons is that data should live where the community can find and use it. So that means that we're not trying to recreate GenBank or any of the other very specific domain repositories or databases that are out there, because those are the community agreed upon standards, and we want the data to be where it's most easily found. We also believe that data owners are the best ones to know where their data live and can create the best metadata for that. They can describe the data better than we can. So we can go out, and we have gone out to locate a lot of the databases that are out there, but we need to work with the data owners to make sure that it's described the best way possible. And so we've created DCAN to be a self-submission system, and we've also made sure that it has a harvesting capability so that it can harvest those metadata records from whatever external catalogs are out there. Because we're interested in the reuse of this information for science, we want to set the bar a little bit higher for metadata than perhaps a more general purpose repository might. So some of you may be familiar with Data Dryad. Dryad is the NSF supported repository, and they have very basic metadata, and we have added additional fields on top of that in hopes that we can perhaps raise the bar on making sure that people can understand the data that's in the repository. And in particular, we've added emphasis on data dictionaries. So many of you will be familiar with README files and all the information that would go in a README file that make it possible to really, truly understand what's inside the data file. We're promoting the idea of machine-readable data dictionaries that could then be available for any high-performance computing applications that people might want to do with the data. And then finally, we have curators here in the building who will review these submissions and work with the harvests to make sure that we have a consistent, high-quality description of what we're getting. Okay, just a little bit more on making everything machine readable. So this is what really, for those of you who are thinking about doing the sort of modeling that might require integrating data sets, making sure that as much as possible is available in machine readable formats like JSON and RDF means that people can build applications that will use the Ag Data Commons and whatever data it can access. Again, machine readable data dictionaries. And then also making sure that files are in the best, most machine readable formats possible, like CSV or database actual packages, and then of course links to any code that was used for the analysis. So we're not encouraging people to deposit the code itself on the Ag Data Commons. We're not a code repository, but we want to make sure we know where the code lives. Okay, and the other thing that we're doing is we're making sure that every data set is linked to at least the primary article that might have been associated with the data. And USDA has a project called PubAg, which is here at pubag.nal.usda.org, and it is similar to the PubMed and PubMed Central platforms over at NIH, and this is where you can find a lot of full-text scholarly articles, and you can also find citations of articles at publisher sites, and the idea is a one-stop shop for scholarly literature, and we're doing as much back and forth connecting between the literature and the data as we can. Now you might say, I don't need to spend a lot of time describing the methods that I used with my data in the Ag Data Commons because it's all in the paper. And I'll just share a quick little anecdote about that. I have a colleague who was sharing with me that they had published a very important climate change research paper in one of the Nature journals, and they got a new postdoc, and they asked the postdoc as sort of their initial task to get them used to what this new lab was up to. They said, reanalyze the data from that, serious Nature paper. And it turned out that the postdoc was not able to do it. There was not enough information in the paper or in any documentation that they had about the data set to actually repeat the analysis. And I think they actually had to retract the paper because they couldn't demonstrate that it was repeatable. And so the lesson learned is keep track of all the configurations of your analysis software, keep track of any decisions you had to make while you were working with the data, and if you put it in the Ag Data Commons, it will be there the next time you need that information yourself, much less other people who might want to know those details. Okay, so we are in the process of doing a major one-stop shop push to get as much as we can into the Ag Data Commons, and our goal is the end of 2017, so we actually have less than 2 months for this. And we're starting with the USDA agencies that are part of the Research, Education, and Economics mission area. And so we are describing all of the public databases that each have their own standalone websites. So they're out there, they're already public. There's a great way that you can interact with them online, but they're scattered all around. So we're working to make sure that we know where all of those databases are, not only from Agricultural Research Service, but also NASS and ERS. And then specifically for ARS, we are looking for those significant research data sets where they don't necessarily have their own website just for that data set, but it might already be somewhere online with an FTP site or on a lab website or perhaps in some other repository. Again, they're scattered right now. We want to make sure that we can link to those. And in addition, if there's anything that's ready for public release now, we're going to suggest that the researchers upload those data sets so that they can have a home in the Ag Data Commons. Now, the next line is bolded because NIFA is actually part of the REE mission area. We have not promised to entirely catalog every data product that NIFA has funded, because we know that that's probably going to be a Herculean task, but we're going to look for the low-hanging fruit. And I think those of you in this room have already mentioned a couple of these. If it's already out there, if it was funded by NIFA, if it's going to be a resource of ongoing importance to the community, then we will want to make sure that there's a catalog entry for it in the Ag Data Commons. People often ask, well, what do you mean by data? What data should I put there? And I think that's a hard question to answer for any particular community, because there can be the raw data coming straight off the sensors. You can clean it up a bit. You can analyze and summarize it. I would say all of that is fair game, and part of your task will be to figure out how much of that is actually in scope for an effort like this. And if you all come to a conclusion about how that should work in your workshops, let us know, and we can help make sure that that is broadly shared with the rest of the people who aren't here at this meeting. And then again, we're going to harvest any data sets, any information about data sets. We're not necessarily going to get the data itself. We're just going to know where it is. We'll harvest from existing catalogs. All right, so these are my ask for you. So first of all, what are the major databases and data sets that you already work with, that you've already produced, that are out there, that are important for us to know about at the Ag Data Commons? Similarly, are there existing catalogs or repositories where you've already registered your data and I just need to suck in the metadata so that we know where it is? How much and what kind of data needs to be maintained for the long term? So that's the question I was alluding to before. So we're a library, we're a memory institution. We do have a mandate to keep this stuff safe. We don't necessarily promise we can keep it forever. We're subject to resource constraints like everybody else is. So we're looking to the community to give us guidance on what are the kinds of information that we should keep for 10 years, for 25 years, and so on. What are the ontologies and data dictionaries that are already out there that this community should be using and agreeing on if possible, so that everything is as standardized and integratable as possible? And again, I've got some background in ontologies, and I'd be happy to work with any efforts that are brewing to try to come upon these agreed standards. And is there a way that the Ag Data Commons can promote these shared standards? So if we've got a data dictionary already on the Ag Data Commons and you can use it, then by all means use that data dictionary. That data dictionary will basically be the list of all the measurements and their definitions for what's in your data file. So if you can reuse an existing one, by all means do. Earlier today we heard that even a simple measurement like body length might be measured in many different ways. This was something that we faced at the Encyclopedia of Life. We had to decide, are these things the same? Can we call them the same thing or not? So to the extent that you can use the same definitions, great. If you can't, make sure it's clear that they're different, and we can at least roll them up into a generic body length characteristic within which the researcher will have to do their due diligence and make sure that they're understanding what those terms mean. We've already heard a number of tools described here, software tools, analytical tools. What are the gaps that Ag Data Commons can help fill for that? We're not intending to be a workspace or an analysis platform necessarily, but we are expecting that we can make things a little easier, either by bringing into the platform tools that everybody agrees are useful, by transforming data from one format to another, if that is going to be helpful, or for providing a little bit of exploratory visualization, for example, so that people can get a look at a data set before they go through the effort of actually downloading it. And the last point here is a big one. How do we work with big data platforms? So I know that all of you are starting to deal with data sets that are so large it's hard to imagine moving the data set itself around. So what does that mean for the Ag Data Commons? We can point to it wherever it lives. How can we make it easier for people to do the computing that they need with the data that they discover with us? And so this is just a slide to remind me to mention that we're working as closely as we can with the Agricultural Research Services Big Data High Performance Computing Platform, SciNet, and Ceres. And we're also in discussions with Cyverse because we recognize that these are the kinds of major resources, major infrastructure where people are actually doing the analysis. My question is, what happens when the analysis is done? Where does the data go? Who's keeping it safe for the long term? Cyverse will do this to some extent, but so far they're still getting off the ground on that. We know that Scinet does not intend to be the place where things are kept for posterity. So we need to work closely to make sure that it's easy for the researchers to do the right thing and that they can do the further analysis and reuse that they want to do. All right, so I'm going to summarize by talking again about our vision for the Ag Data Commons. So in this diagram, on the lower left there is the process, the part where we are currently. We're gathering the data. We're trying to figure out where are all the data products that USDA has paid for and will be paying for in the future, because we can then build on that to go further and do some transformation. And the final step of that, of course, is not just transforming it, but basically making sure that it's translated into ways that people can really use for decision making and for action. We're just getting started on this effort, and to some extent we can already provide a little bit of exploration and visualization, but we're really focusing on that gathering step. So for those of you who are sitting on major data products that you're using, that other people are using, we'd appreciate it if you could register on the site and let us know where they are. We have a webinar coming up November 28th. So that if you wanted to get a demonstration of how it works, you're welcome to do that, but you don't have to. We also have some instructional videos on YouTube. Just do a search for Ag Data Commons Instruction Series and you'll find it. We also have a data submission guide online. You can find it under the About link. And then finally, at any time, you can contact us by email and we'll do our best to help you with the process. But I encourage you, if you haven't already, to just log in and hit the Submit Data button and see that it's really not that challenging to submit your data. This is designed to take hopefully no more than half an hour. If it's taking more time than half an hour, I want to know, because we need to do our best to streamline the process a little bit. All right, and I just wanted to end with a little note about data management planning. So starting in in the request for proposals for 2018, NIFA is going to be explicitly requiring the data management plans for AFRI projects be part of the proposal package. This is a requirement that NSF has had for years, so some of you who've been funded by NSF have already done this. The NIFA requirement is very similar, and the library has been working with NIFA to make sure that we're on the same page about this. And in the data management plan, which is 2 pages, at most, it doesn't have to be 2 pages, it could just be a page. You'll declare upfront who's responsible for the data throughout its life, where the data are going to be managed, both during the project and after the project has concluded, what metadata and data standards are going to be used, what are the specific copyright and licensing provisions for all the different kinds of data that you'll be working with, and importantly, to make sure that the data management plan is convincing that there are enough resources to actually properly manage the data. So of course, if you want to use the Ag Data Commons to disseminate your data afterwards, that right now is pretty easy. You just include in your data management plan that Ag Data Commons will be part of your strategy, and right now this is free. That's another reason to do it right now. We're probably going to have to start charging people down the road, but for now you can register things for free. What we're also providing now is consultation on these data management plans. So we have put some resources online if you haven't prepared one of these before, and we suggest that you draft up your first stab at that plan, and then if you want some help with it, you can contact us at our NAL ADC Curator email address. All right, so to find those online resources, you just go to the main National Ag Library website, nal.usda.gov, and click on Data in the menu. And that's all I have, and I'm happy to take some questions. Thanks.
So there are some data sets that are like of terabyte size that don't have repositories. Would you be able to take those kinds of data sets?
So we anticipate that that's going to be a problem. We've already had to turn away things that are like 25 terabytes. 1 terabyte we actually probably could handle, but I think what we're going to have to do is work with our other federal agency partners and try to figure out what's the long-term way to do this. But we are already planning for how much more we're going to have to expand our storage for these kinds of data sets. It will help us to know what kind of data sets they are and make sure that those costs are built into your forthcoming grants, and that's part of the charging that we're probably going to have to do. There will be a limit on what you can do for a basic fee, and then as many repositories are starting to do, we'll have to charge an overage fee for any huge amounts of data if you happen to have big data.
I was wondering, well, that question was about long-term storage because you can't build that cost into your grant. So I'm in charge of the Missouri NSF EPSCoR project CI team, and we have Doppler radar data every 5 minutes for 5 years, and we have also UAV data similar to what Natalia is collecting from Maze, and so we don't really have a repository for either one of those. So those are some examples where NSF wants us to say what we're going to do with it forever, and we don't have an answer. So.
Yeah, no, I totally appreciate that. I've been going to lots of UAV discussions because I know that that's going to be a huge thing going forward, and I would love to provide that place, but we have to figure out how to fund that and how to keep it going. And I think we recognize that even after your 3-year project or your 5-year project is done, we want the data to remain available. So we have to figure out the business model for those costs so that we can promise that we'll keep it for whatever time we think we can keep it for. So that'll be built into the cost.
So what are you doing to avoid redundancy? So you talked about Ag Data Commons, Data Dryad already exists. You talked about PubAg, PubMed already exists.
So part of the avoiding redundancy is why we're a catalog first and a repository second. So if the data already live in some other repository, then we can have a catalog record for it and point to it. That way we can make it discoverable, but we don't actually have to confuse people with where does the authoritative version of this data set live. Now that said, I just want to add that websites go down, projects end, a lot of research-funded projects can't sustainably maintain that repository or that database that you have online. And so one of the things, and this again goes to the business model and how we can afford to do all this, one idea is that we can point to those external resources. It would be great, and we can't afford to do this yet, but it would be great if we could also grab a dark copy for the archive so that if something does happen to that external resource, that at least we have a version of it that may not necessarily be, up to the minute of the last date, but at least we have something to fall back on if something catastrophic happens. But we don't have the funding for that, but we need it for the rest of the library too. This is long-term preservation, and we know it's important.
Other questions for Cynthia? Okay. If not, thank you, Cynthia. She was going to come back at the break,
Next coffee break
this
yeah.
afternoon for a coffee break if anyone wanted to have more informal conversations at that point in time. So thank you. Oh, yeah, Carl.
Curious, when will we get guidelines for costs?
When we have those costs figured out.
Yeah,
so
when will we get guidelines for costs that we're going to have to incorporate into grant proposals?
I would love to talk to people at the break about what you think is reasonable to put into your NIFA grants. So we have language in the calls that basically say, make sure to include these costs. I have some ideas about what we think the costs might be, but we'd like to talk with the community first.
Okay. So thank you, Cynthia.